Shekhar Shah, Director General NCAER, Dr. Bimal Jalan, former President NCAER and Chairman Center for Development Studies, and also the Chair for today's session, presenters and invited discussants, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and a very warm welcome to all of you. Incidentally, Dr. Jalan has earlier chaired this seminar in 2004, 2011 and 2014. The mid-year review of the Indian economy is an apex event on IIC's program schedule, and it is our privilege to host the annual Malcolm Adisesha Mid-Year Review in collaboration with NCAER for the past 6 years. NCAER has done pioneering research work in applied economics and designing and executing large-scale surveys on regional and human development. The NCAER and IIC share these developmental concerns. This review, I feel, is the best tribute to Dr. Malcolm Adisesha, who was a life trustee of the IIC. As a development economist and educator, he was committed to eradicating poverty and illiteracy and fostering growth in a modern economy. He wore many hats, earned several awards, and contributed his expertise to innumerable institutions. Dr. Adisesha was associated with UNESCO for over 25 years, and over this period, he transformed it from a group of developed nations to a global association concerned with science, culture, education, and the development of all nations. The Madras Institute of Development Studies was closest to his heart. More than 30 years on, it still retains his vision of a vibrant, rigorous, and liberal space for advanced research in economy, polity, and society. He continued his support to teaching and research in these areas even after his death in 1994, willing all his finances to the setting up of a trust. The Malcolm and Elizabeth Adisesha Trust was born in 1999. The trust has supported this annual seminar at the Indian International Center since 2001. The mid-year review is an attempt to examine the course of macroeconomic trends for the first half of the year and provide an assessment of the prospects of the economy for the full year. The proceedings are subsequently published as the NCAER IIC Mid-Year Review of the Economy, which is an invaluable resource on the trends in the Indian economy. Among the issues covered are expected growth, inflation, balance of payments, fiscal balances, savings, and investment trends. It also explores the state of important sectors of the economy, both financial and corporate sectors, and the policy responses. What deserves praise is that it is based on independent, evidence-based, and own research agenda. These reviews enable an appreciation of both the weaknesses and strengths of the contemporary Indian economy and India's position in the international economic order. But what happens in the final analysis was summed up best by Dr. Jalan in his thought-provoking statement as the chairperson of this review in 2011, when he said, "Where India is today, it has never had a better advancing position. But what we do with it is our discretion." It also reminds me of what Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the US Federal Reserve, said when asked to compare the rise of India and China. He said, "It is not what China is doing that is remarkable. It's what India is not, and that about sums up the Indian story." We are grateful to Dr. Shekhar Shah and his team for their collaboration. I now request Dr. Shah to please commence the proceedings for today's review.
Thank you, Air Marshal Verma. It's a testimony to our armed forces that whether in uniform or out a commander and a leader of our armed forces is able to fly all kinds of terrain, including terrain that I know is not very familiar to Varmaji in terms of the economics of what we do, but certainly in the introduction that he just gave was about as erudite as it could be. So thank you so much for that, and thank you for hosting us. This is our tribute to Malcolm. Somebody that I have personally derived great inspiration from his life devoted to public service, and even after his life, to be able to continue and contribute to discussions and dialogues like that. And I'm really privileged to be part of this endeavor that he has left behind. It's also a great source of comfort that MIDS, the Madras Institute of Development Studies that he set up, is in safe hands with one of our ex-colleagues, Dr. Shashank Bede, who is the director of that center and very well known and a personal friend to many in this room. So that's another link that we have with the trust and with Malcolm Adisesha. I also bring greetings from some of the trustees of the Malcolm Adisesha and Malcolm and Elizabeth Adisesha Trust, who, though they cannot be present, are very aware of this event and are grateful to both IIC and to NCER in continuing this really remarkable tradition. It's also a mark of having arrived that I routinely get a call from the finance ministry saying, please send us the media review of the economy that you've just done, because I know it's used as a element and input into the preparation for the budget. So that's again should be a source of comfort for our NCR team that is doing this, because clearly it is read. I'm delighted that Dr. Jalan is here. Dr. Jalan is a close personal friend of NCR, somebody who he has devoted a lot of time to. His archives, his office papers from when he really entered public life and economics are at the NCR library. We are working further to continue to be the repository for his archival papers. He's a prolific writer, has just published a new book, and I believe another one is just coming out on the one that has just come out is kind of the agenda for the remaining years of the current government, but then he's looking to the future as well. And we are already discussing yet another book project that will go back to the second five-year plan and look at all the promises we were making ourselves, eradication of poverty, eradication of illiteracy, a range of different things. And we're setting targets that today seem somewhat ridiculous in terms of where we are, and explaining why and how that has happened. So Dr. Jalan is a font of wisdom and of forward-looking ideas, besides all the things that he has done. And in the materials you have with you, you see the long list. To me, my simple way of putting it is Dr. Jalan has occupied every position of policymaking that is possible in this country. So there's nothing left out as such. So it's a great delight to have him chair this session. I want to congratulate the team. They've been working very hard. I know they were up till about 2 or so in the morning last night, working away. We have some new innovations which I hope we'll have a little time to discuss. And I particularly want to flag one, and then I'll stop. As all of us know who watch the numbers, GDP forecasts come out, GDP numbers come out once every quarter. But the way in which economies are evolving and transforming themselves and being impacted by both domestic and global events, we almost need to know the temperature of the patient every hour, rather than simply being able to take it once a week or once a day. And so there is a new mode of thinking about economic activity and measuring it. Many people call it nowcasting in comparison to forecasting. And NCR has entered this world of nowcasting, and we actually are now looking at GDP within the quarter. Clearly, this is a first step we are taking. A lot of refinement will happen, but we will share some of those results as well. And I think it's very important to do that. There are other ways of doing this, and we are also looking, for example, at GST data. GST data, if used, that's really in the category of big data, but if we are able to use that data well, we pretty much could to say, we pretty much could say what was the level of economic activity in a particular sector, in a particular region yesterday, simply because we have the returns, the GST returns from the massive database that is now being created. So these are all forward-looking opportunities that we look forward to ourselves in terms of what we can do in assessing the health of the economy. With that, let me stop and turn over to my distinguished mentor and friend, Dr. Bimal Jalan.
For your very kind words and for giving an idea of the scope of work that NCER has already done or has been doing, and the new process that it is going to adopt. Now, this is very different from the normal media review meetings that most institutions have, in the sense that the primary focus here is not on the statistics per se. They are important, but the more important issue is the policy issues. And he has focused on some of that. I don't want to get into it at the moment, but we have a very distinguished group of people who would be discussing it further. And let me just mention our whole program. I mean, you have the program with you. What we plan to do is, after a few minutes, when I stop, you will have Bornali Bhandari, who will give the media review of the Indian economy, and that is the main sort of focal point of what we'll be discussing later. Then after the media review of the Indian economy, we have Pinaki Chakravarti, who will be talking about GST reforms, which is very current, and a lot of discussion has already taken place, but I very much look forward to hearing Pinaki also on how he is looking at it from the NIPFP point of view or as a researcher point of view. And of course, then we have Tushar Arora. He's not here yet, but Shakshi Gupta, they are expected to come and join us, and they will be discussing some of the select issues in the financial markets, which is also of utmost importance from the development point of view and the policy point of view, because what happens in the real economy is very fundamentally determined by what happens in the financial markets, because there is borrowing, there is capital, there is so on and so forth. So and after that, we have tea break. I'm just going through the program. After these, the main speakers have spoken, we have a tea break, and which will be followed by what is referred to as open discussion. And I'm very glad that Manoj Panda is here, who would be who is an invited discussant. The rest of you would be speaking as non-invited. Non-invited persons, but I think we can have a good exchange of views on the media.
Trust Dr. Jalan to catch every oddity, whether in markets or in seminar programs.
No, so I don't want to take any more of your time, except to say that it's a very good opportunity to not only mention what we have achieved, but what the challenges in the future are. I mean, I think this is also of utmost importance, because what is happening in our economy, the main focus of economists tends to be on the rate of growth. I mean, if you look at all the literature or everything else and the daily media and everywhere else, it is 6.2 or 6.7 or 5.7, what is the range, and that is the most important thing. Now, it doesn't matter what is the first digit or the second digit, I mean, but that is the focus. Then we talk about inflation, and we talk about, what is happening on the investment and so on and so forth. But the real issue, to my mind, which I hope we will also deal with, is that why is it that after in the 70th year of independence, the largest number of poor in human history are in India. And by poor, I don't mean in terms of how the World Bank or somebody classifies in terms of poverty line, but in terms of basic, what you might say, our index on our rank in the Human Development Index, in terms of some fundamental needs of the people in general, which is nutrition, health, literacy, and so on and so forth. I don't want to take any more of your time. Let me now invite Barnali to give us a presentation on the mid-year review of the Indian economy.
Dr. Jalan, may I just add that we are live on the web. This is being webcast. That should not constrain anybody from saying what they want, but truth in advertising requires me to say that we are actually live on the web with people who want to log in and watch the proceedings of this event. Bonali.
Thank you, Dr. Jalan, Dr. Shah, and Mr. Verma, Dr. Marshall Verma for the introductions. This mid-year review, good morning, everybody. This mid-year review, this is well, a small part, but it's historical because last year, around on 5th of November, we had our last mid-year review, and it was 3 days later, basically, when demonetization was announced. All our forecast, of course, went down the drain after that. All our hopes and forecasts went down the drain after that. So it has been, it's been quite a momentous year, and we just passed 3 days after, 3 days ago was the anniversary of demonetization. So it'd be interesting where we sort of take not only a look back at demonetization in terms of the macro indicators, but in the background, we also look at the medium-term uncertainties, that we have to understand demonetization and the introduction of goods and services tax, the short-term challenges in the background of the medium-term uncertainty, and what is that doing to our macroeconomic indicators. And we sort of have a broad look at the macroeconomics of not just growth, but growth, inflation, employment, current account, and fiscal deficit. The standard indicators any macroeconomist would look at to get a sense of where the economy is going. So on that note, we'll start this thing. This work, of course, is being done with a very large team so I'll just switch. Large team of people, and we thank you to the team for this thing. I'm just the face of the team today. So this is an economy in transition, and the title, the challenge is the medium-term uncertainty, looking at the short-term challenges in the background of the medium-term uncertainty. And what is the macroeconomic outlook based on these challenges? So the medium-term uncertainty, just to give you a sense of perspective, is we are looking at the 5 key indicators: economic growth, inflation, fiscal balance, current account balance, and unemployment. So when you look at this indicator, this is the NCR Business Confidence Index, and it tells us, shows us the data. NCR conducts a business expectations survey, sentiment survey every quarter. So it gives us a unique perspective on every quarter of what is going on in the economy, especially from the firm side. When we look at this number from July 2003 onwards, you can see the big dip right there, which is the great financial recession. But you can see there's a clear divide. Of course, we can do many more statistics with it, but you can even visually you can see there's a lot of volatility after 2008 and much more stability before 2003. And this uncertainty is what this medium-term uncertainty is what we are talking is very, very significant. It's not just that it's India is the only country caught up in this web of uncertainty. Other countries internationally, we have seen the world being caught up in this web of uncertainty. I just want to again emphasize this again is by just looking at a few quarters of the data from January 2014 of Business Confidence Index. And when you look at this information again, Just the last 3 years from January 2014 to July 2017 is this constant uncertainty where it's going up and down. And of course, you can see this fall in January 2017, which is the business expectation survey was conducted in December 2016. The fall in sentiments, the massive rise, and then some readjustment here. I won't tell you what happens in the September one, that you'll have to wait for the press release. But the business sentiments have been changing from quarter to quarter. What has happened to economic growth in that last 3 years? Economic growth, if you look at just broadly look at economic growth in services, what we find is that post 2015-16 quarter 4, economic growth has fallen. It has directly fallen this thing. When we look at agriculture, we find that agriculture has actually gone up from 15-16 quarter 3, but after 16-17 quarter 3 again it has fallen. But we still have seen some positive growth. When you look at industry, we find that industry has actually fallen completely from 15-16 quarter 4, and services is the same story. The difference between the industry and the services story is that after 16-17 quarter 3, while services shows some improvement, the red line here, but industry keeps on falling. Industry, there is a widening gap between industry and services growth rates. This is the data for the last 3 years. So economic growth overall has been moderating. What we find is inflation has also moderated. This is our WPI inflation, wholesale price index. We find that it has, while the trend is up clearly, but it has moderated below just between 2 and 4%. We find the CPI combined inflation has also fallen down continuously, and it is also the WPI and the CPI have converged. So the long run trends show that in the medium run anyway, the inflation has been moderating. What about the twin deficits? Current account deficit is a nice U-shaped current account as a percentage of GDP was 4.8% in 12-13. We know that the tapering tantrums in September 2013. And since then, helped by the fall in oil prices, crude oil prices, around mid-June 2014, our current account deficit has come down significantly. And so we find current account deficit actually slightly going so this is a growth rate in current account deficit. The current account deficit is actually worsening. To negative 2.5%. When we find the fiscal deficit, the fiscal deficit is actually come down constantly. So what we find is the current account deficit has been after staying low between 2014 and 16-17. For 17-18 quarter 1, it has went up to 2.5%. It's a sort of reverse of what has happened, and the fiscal deficit has constantly come down. The challenge is employment. In employment, we find that this is where the evidence is the weakest on employment growth. And there is some recent data paper which found that employment has improved between March 2010 and March 2012, but shrunk by 0.4% per annum between 13-14 and 15-16. And the sense is that given that growth has been even weaker after 15-16, that employment would have shrunk even further. But employment estimates are notoriously very difficult to estimate, and we haven't had a thick ground post 2011-12. So even this paper combines various sorts of data, uses novel method to estimate this information. So in the medium run, on the key macro parameters, India seems to have underperformed on growth and unemployment, but on other indicators, it seems to be performing fine. So that's the medium run background. In the short run, the last 1 year, what has happened? So before we go to the numbers, bury ourselves in numbers. Here is just a sense of what is happening in the economy. Is when demonetization was introduced, it did introduce, it sets up a chain reaction in the economy. 2 years prior, we had two back-to-back, before 2016, 14, 2 years, we had two back-to-back droughts. So in 2016, when we had normal monsoon, the expectation, even in the forecast we write that we read the last mid-year, we write there was reason for hope because we had normal monsoon, rural demand should pick up after two back-to-back droughts. But instead, the demonetization has introduced, I'm not saying demonetization, but it has set up a chain of events because it's a more secondary impact, that the agriculture had suffered from cash constraints, credit constraints, which increased the financial stress of farmers who were already under duress, which led to popular demand for farm loan waivers, which in turn could potentially lead to state fiscal deficits discussed in the monetary policy reports. So it sets, what I'm trying to say, it sets up a macroeconomic chain of events. Even today's, then if given the current monsoon as we discuss further, this in turn may have some impact on the stress of farmers because in June, the rain, we weren't sure of the monsoon, the temporal and spatial variation. We are in a much more firm position to say what has happened with the the monsoon season. Demonetization also helped, also led to excess liquidity in the system. This excess liquidity kept on existing. Again, it is while the recent monetary policy reports says it may not be a problem, but again, there's debate whether that led to the appreciation of the exchange rate, which in turn would possibly affect exports imports. Again, we'll find out whether it did or not. And again, it sets up a chain reaction in the economy. But then we also had, we have in the background, of course, inflation targeting was introduced in the economy, which to maintain a certain inflation rate, which we've seen to succeed to some has kept the interest rate to a certain order. But interest rates have been higher relative to the rest of the world, which meant that we attracted foreign inflows, which in turn meant that rupee appreciated, and again, it added to the excess liquidity issue. This might adversely affect exports. NPAs in the banking, non-performing assets in the banking sector has been a challenge. The latest financial stabilization report again says that the gross non-performing assets have increased. What does that affect? It affects the transmissions of rate cuts in the economy, which again, despite the RBI cutting the interest rates, it's not transmitting down. The recent monetary policy report reports that the demonetization has actually improved some of the transmission mechanism. And even in our evidence, we find that there is some improved transmission. But given these, and the last but not the least, the most recent one was the goods and services taxes, which was introduced in July 2017. But the interesting thing is that people were, while the firms, the stakeholders, the firms specifically were recovering from demonetization in the first quarter, but they were also anticipating, they were preparing in anticipation of the goods and services, implementation of goods and services taxes. Basically, the first quarter, if you see the IIP indicators, there was no movement or very little movement at all. And it continues the same in the second quarter as we see the numbers later. So it's been an extremely challenging first half of the year for the firms. We are just stating the facts. So all these factors are related to each other, leading to intercorrelations, setting up a chain movement and affecting each other. And this is basically the short-run macro challenges. In the international scenario, what we find is that international scenario, the latest IMF World Economic Outlook October update shows a more benign scenario for the world, where we see that the advanced and advanced economies have all positive growth rates. At least growth rate forecasts have improved. All the arrows here show. All these arrows here show that between July and October, the forecasts are much better, improved now. India, of course, has been this 2017. It has been down. There has been the forecasts have been cut, have been lowered. So with this, the international world is slightly more benign, but we also know that there are protectionist tempers in the world economy, as the world also is caught up in their own web of uncertainty. So with that in the international background, what we find is the latest gross value added at basic prices. Here, essentially, this is the most interesting story, that gross value added at basic prices. There is another challenge is while RBI looks at gross value added at basic prices for measuring the income of the economy, the rest of the world is looking at gross domestic product. So there is a challenge of what to use to actually assess the economy, and they have been known to diverge significantly. This time they are not diverging, but it is the fact that divergences occur between GDP MP and GDP market prices and gross value added. So with gross value added, we find that basically the first 6 months between January to June 2017, the last quarter of the 2016-17 and the first quarter of 2017-18 was the GVA growth was at 5.6%. Essentially, between January to June, the economy has stagnated. There were some good growth stories, but more or less the electricity, gas, and water is one we see some positive growth. Construction improved slightly after being in recession in the fourth quarter. Trade, hotels and restaurants, and financial real estate these two sectors are the strong sectors which have pulled up growth, and the services have actually pulled up growth and keep on driving the economy. But IIP manufacturing, the GVA manufacturing is what's pulling the economy down, and that has been between January to June. When we look at gross fixed capital formation, our key measure of investment, we find that it has fallen, and from 16-17 quarter one to almost for the whole of last year. It's only in the first quarter we actually see some movement, which is very good news. We have actually looked in our business expectation survey. We also look at we asked the firms whether they think the present investment climate is positive. Since almost 2011, less than 50% of firms responded, with exceptions of few quarters, that present investment climate is positive. So any sign of sentiment improving and actually investment improving is a sign of good news in the economy. This is the consumption expenditure, public-private final consumption expenditure, which has been a driving force of the economy, and even this has actually come down, has been coming down, and in 17-18 quarter one, it has actually fallen. For quarter two, the economy caught in this transition between the significant, of course, the background is that the GST was implemented in July 2017. And the firms, the interesting thing is how are firms performing, given our assessments, given our theory, and given our hypothesis, are the firms actually behaving in that sort of predicted ways, or do you find some surprises? The good news, unilaterally good news, better news is that the rainfall, the temporal, it's uneven news. The temporal distribution of rainfall has been better than not been so better than last year. 17-18 is actually worse off than 16-17. But the interesting thing is the spatial distribution of rainfall is actually better than last year. So while temporally we have not done that well, but spatially we have. So overall, NCR estimates suggest that overall we are, compared to last year, 95% of the long period average is what Indian Meteorological Department tells us. But overall, given our estimates, that it has been more or less normal. And we find that NCR estimates suggest the Ministry of Agriculture took out has the first advance estimates, and I didn't report it in the PPT because it was done much before the end of the rainfall, so there might have been an underestimate. So the NCRA estimate suggests that Kharif rice is going to be, she's going to show 2.1% and 3.3% growth rates. Coarse cereals is where we see very negative territory. Pulses, we see some movement. Food grains, in total we see movement. Not so much in oil seeds. Cotton is some movement, and sugarcane also the estimates will vary. So the overall picture is that maybe the rainfall, the distribution of the rainfall, temporal and spatial, suggests that the Kharif output is going to be almost same or better than last year. But if you look at the water storage, the reservoir water storage, it is 96% of the last 10 years. And again, that means that the outlook for Rabi output is also, it's good news. So overall, the agriculture sector seems to be, based on the estimates, suggests that the agriculture sector will be better, if not at least the same as last year, if not better. Food inflation has been muted. We had seen double-digit food inflation of pulses that has come down. Industry. Industry, unfortunately, the numbers came out yesterday night for April to September, between September. And we find that the manufacturing story, which is the driving story behind this thing, is unilaterally not very good news. IIP manufacturing has fallen, comparing to the last half year. Even electricity has fallen, mining shows some improvement. Overall, IIP has fallen. When we look at use-based classification of goods, again, comparing the 2 half years, we find that, again, almost all goods are showing negative growth. Capital goods is showing negative 0.2% growth, but if you look at the numbers, August and September shows very positive growth. Core industry is also showing, again, core industry actually performed much better than, not much better, they also showed slowed growth right there. And the two stories are coal and crude oil, natural gas, which showed more growth than last year, which are at least the more significant stories. So industrial growth has definitely slowed down compared to last year. When we look at services, the services story is quite interesting. Tourism arrivals, even though it's compared to last year, it's much larger, but we find that tourism arrivals have been, even though in double digit, they have been show a slightly downward trend, probably coming from a very high base effect. But tourism arrivals has been quite strong in the Indian economy. Revenue earning traffic is quite improving. Cargo handled at major ports is strong, slightly weaker than last year. And production of commercial vehicles, the number hides a story that we saw negative 11% growth rate in the first quarter and 15% growth rate in the second quarter. So that's the story is completely flipped. And the banking indicators, of course, continue to be very weak. The aviation sector is another very interesting story, where we see that passenger traffic and cargo traffic has gone up significantly so. The passenger traffic, actually, we see some slowing down, even again, though in double digits, it might be just the high base thing. But the international cargo traffic actually jumps up from 5% to 19% between last quarter and this quarter. So it is this pickup in the international cargo aviation traffic means there is some movement in the economy, and again, it's a signal of good news that services sector seems to be doing well. When we look at the Purchasing Manager Index for the outlook of the industry, we find that when you look at manufacturing and services, services has actually been negative for July and August. September, it actually showed improvement. And even PMI manufacturing actually showed upward growth. The interesting thing is when you look at PMI manufacturing in October, which sort of shows up right here, the yellow line, And, sorry. The interesting thing is, even though it's above 50, and that means the PMI is growing, but the growth is again weakening. So while the first half of the year is pretty much, we know it's going to be weaker, the second half of the year, even if we do see some recovery, at least for industrial growth, it still may be on shaky grounds. So we might see a sort of a shaky recovery by all indicators. So it's not recession, but definitely is the PMI is indicating that we still are not out of the woods in the next half of the year. External sector. The external sector is the interesting story. Yes, exports has recovered. That is very, very after a long, you can see here the growth Y-on-Y has wavered, has stayed low. It increased in the last year and then went down. The interesting thing that the main message that from this graph I want to point out to you here is that the merchandise exports is actually quite volatile compared to the service export, compared to merchandise imports, which seems to be more higher. It shows higher growth rate and more consistent growth rate. So if we are expecting or hoping that external demand will help us pull us through this, that is, again, it's uncertain. And here is this question where, again, we had posed, we've shown you this graph, it's showing that is appreciating rupee, does it actually affect exports or imports? When you look at these pictures right here, this is the yellow line is showing that the rupee is appreciating. We find that the exports is, this is the Y-on-Y, exports is recovering despite the appreciating rupee. This is the merchandise exports. And the service exports is completely impervious to any exchange rate changes. So essentially is, at least in the short run, and this is not a surprise because we know economic theory tells us J-curve effect exists, contracts are signed beforehand, but there is no immediate impact on exports, or at least there's no statistically significant impact that we can talk about exports and the appreciating rupee, at least in the short run. Money and capital markets, again, we talked about transmission rates earlier. Here, when we find the latest data shows us that there is some movement, but more or less lending rates have been quite stagnant, but SBI has been lowering its MCLR. From August onwards, we see some movement. Uptake of banking credit by MSMEs still seem quite limited. MSMEs are one of the driving forces in the economy, particularly affected by both demonetization and goods and services taxes. Even though the business confidence index shows revival, ours is still focused on 6 cities and more the formal sector. We don't completely are able to catch even the informal sector in the 6 metros. So the MSMEs, and this graph right here, is micro, small, and medium enterprises, the uptake of credit still seems to be quite low. And even in June 2017, NCR had also asked about credit outlook. We find that only 43% of firms were having interested in for credit. That also for working capital they were interested, and only 36% of firms were actually interested in investment, for investment purposes. The Sensex has been booming. And the fear is, while the first half of we benefited from commodity prices, the challenge is that the crude oil prices seem to be creeping up. In October, it has gone up to 57. And here's a question for Dr. Ghate is, will the inflation targeting work with the crude oil prices creeping up? And that's the challenge, the short-run policy challenge. Public finances have actually improved in share of capital to total expenditure, which is good news for the economy right here. And improvement in revenue to gross fiscal deficit. It's in positive territory, which again means that there is some GST has contributed around 22% of total revenue. So, and the fiscal deficit indicator so far indicates that the fiscal outlook is quite benign in terms of revenue. So it's the deficit concerns are that India still may be on track, maybe on track. So in sum, the forecast for transitioning economy, it's always very challenging to forecast when there's the dynamic changes that's taking place every month. These are the summary of the GDP forecast from a range of institutions and agencies, and almost everybody has said 6.7 to 7%. Early, almost all of them are early October, and consumer inflation around 3.8 to 4%. What does NCR say? NCR is the two legacy models are the quarterly model and the annual model. The annual model is showing 6% growth rate for the whole year. It is showing 5.7% growth rate for the second quarter. NCR had correctly predicted the growth as 5.6% last quarter. And second quarter it has predicted 5.7%. It does, because of the rural sector and some and maybe restocking and so on, we will see some upward movement in the industry. So the second half definitely is going to be better than the first half. How much better and how much sustainable is a real question. The annual model, I'm not discussing the assumptions here. The annual model is showing both GVA and GDP to be growing at 6.2%, agriculture at 3%, industry at 4.5%, services at 7.6%. Current account deficit overshoots, at least the estimates are suggesting that it's overshooting to 3.4%, and ideally it should be around 3.2%. Sorry, sir? Fiscal deficit.
You called it the current account.
Yes. Yeah, sorry. This is the current account deficit and this is the fiscal deficit. It should be around 3.2% as per the fiscal targets, but the estimate is showing slightly higher at 3.4%. So this, without further ado, we go to the next model, which is in development. Okay. Welcome.
Recently, I think NCR have been trying to.
Can you turn on your microphone, please? And let me introduce Dr. Sanjeev Purohit, also senior fellow at NCAR, who has been working with our younger colleague, Dr. Shomo Baduri, on the new cast and the now casting approach. And so we just wanted to introduce this. This is something that's under development, but as any research institution, we are always keen to get comments on even things that are under development. So, Dr. Purohit.
Yeah. We have one more team member, Anusha. I think I should mention that. Now, this work, GDP nowcasting, is a new thing. It's an ongoing work. We have been only starting 2-3 months back. We have been starting the work, and there will need a lot of improvement, etc. The variables list, we are not yet exhausted. Why nowcasting? As nowcasting defined as a prediction of the present, the very near future, and the very recent past. More broadly, we can define it as an exercise of reading through the lens of a model, the flow of data releases in real time. As you know, GDP numbers basically are released for a quarter in advance. And in between the quarter, we have no estimate how the economy is performing. On the other hand, a lot of data series are being released on a monthly basis or quarterly basis. The question is, now in nowcasting, what we try to do is, can we use these monthly numbers and try to predict GDP within a quarter? This is the basically target. Apart from this, nowadays, as you can see, the data like the GST data, kind of file output we can get. Also nowadays, another thing, latest data is the special geospatial data from the space, like luminosity index, night sky map. If we can use we are getting night sky map of every day. Can we combine this kind of index, how its luminosity in the economic activity changes? Like vegetation index. We can get vegetation data of vegetation map every day. Can we combine this data and try to see how the vegetation changes over time? our month basis or quarterly daily basis. This kind of data, this kind of geoposition data, we need to incorporate to get our more better estimate of these nowcasting models. But we are not yet able to do it. It's only a preliminary stage. So basically, what we are doing is we can get up speed quickly. Nowcasting identify data series that matters in the economy. So for each sector of the economy, we try to identify some data series which may better underline the dynamic factors of that sectors. And as the more data comes for the sector, we modify our estimates. So we can do this kind of a monthly basis. We can try to get some of a better kind of GDP. It's not very good forecast, but within the quarter, it's a very good kind of track of the economy. Basically, the sector we try to do it, agriculture, forestry, these are the sectors for which we usually get quarterly GDP numbers. So that was the reason we try to do on this sector. Of course, I should mention that our nowcasting models are now for the sectors we have done it for mining and quarrying, manufacturing, electricity, gas, water supply, and construction, trade, hotel, etc., financial and public administration. For agriculture, we have not done a nowcasting model. Basically, we are doing ANIMA kind of structure for this. But once we use the geoposition data for the agriculture sector, probably we can do a nowcasting also for the sectors. For each of these.
Thank you.
Okay. What happened? There are more slides out there.
There are a few more slides actually.
What happened? I think, oh. Anyway.
They are thanking you.
So basically,
You can speak without this.
yeah.
It's really more important.
So each of the sector, basically we try to identify variables and do it. Like for example, and the kind of growth number we get basically, for agriculture sector, as I was saying, it's basically ANIMA kind of, we are getting around 2.3% quarterly for quarter 2 forecast. For mining and quarrying, our number is 4.69% growth. Manufacturing, 6.30. Electricity, gas, water supply, 3.41. And trade is doing good, 6.86%. And financial, real estate and professional services, 7.31% growth. Public administration is 6.33. Overall, it comes around 5.77 growth for this quarter 2. For quarter 3, we are assuming is 5.65%. But of course, we must mention nowcasting forecast out of quarter are not good. Once we more get data, we need to devise this next quarter forecast. I think that is basically things. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Boy.
Thank you.
For an excellent presentation, and I understand that in the this midterm review of the economy, this book, page 85, has full details of nowcasting model. Page 85. So you can have a look at it because this is the beginning of the process. Now, there are just, I think it has been an excellent presentation, Burnali. I must say you've covered everything that needs to be covered. The main issue that I think we should discuss when we are here, that what we are talking about, there is a tendency among us, among economists, to talk about, now you're talking about nowcasting day to day. Then you are casting about quarterly. Yeah. But what we need to see is whether the dip in GDP numbers and employment numbers as contrasted with inflation and what you might say inflation and the medium-term uncertainties, are they secular or is it a cyclical downturn? Now, if it is a cyclical downturn, then obviously, something which is rising very fast would slow down. Like any other product or any other thing. Or structurally, is that there is some basic issues which need to be tackled. And in the terms of the basic issues, what is it? Is it policy? And midterm review is about policy, much more about policy than what you might call the statistical part. So we have to think about it. Is it structural? Is it fundamentals? Because fundamentals of India is still very strong. Of that, there is no doubt. If you look at capital, if you look at technology, capital we have talked about, it has dipped. But still it is 27, 28%. And similarly, If you look about technology, I mean, there is no, scarcity of technology, there is no scarcity of land, and so on. So if employment is being affected, total employment and job creation is being affected, is it cyclical or structural? This is one issue that I think we will discuss when we have the discussion on the whole thing. But I thought I would just mention it for you to think about it, Barnali, because it's such an excellent presentation. And thank you very much. Thank you, Pohit, also. Now, may I invite, the next one is GST reform. Pinaki is here, Pinaki Chakraborty. He is from NIPFP, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. So look forward to reading, to hearing him. It's one of the most important issues that we are now discussing, GST reform.
Thank you, sir. And I thank NCR, especially Dr. Chadha and Bornali, for inviting me to this important meeting. On GST, I think this is a topic so difficult at the moment because it's changing continuously. So even there has been some major changes last evening. So I thought I'll discuss some of these issues and what are its implications in terms of having a good and simple tax, as we have been talking about it for quite some time. Now, if we look at GST, since 2007, when it was first announced in the budget that it will be introduced in 2010, we have come a long way, and finally it was introduced in July 2017, so almost after 10 years. Now, post this, I think there has been a sense in the country that GST is a very bad tax, and it has created a lot of problem. I think there we have to make a distinction between the tax and the design of the tax. I think how you design that decides outcome. So I think it is very important that when you talk about GST, a clear distinction has to be made about the design and the fundamentals of a simple tax like GST. Now, before I come to that, I also want to highlight another point by way of introduction. The challenges that we faced post July 1st, I think, are transitional in nature and can be handled. But some of the fundamental reforms have happened due to the introduction of GST. Now, what is the fundamental reform? The fundamental reform is the constitutional amendment. If prior to the constitutional amendment, states were not allowed to tax services, center was not allowed to tax goods up to the retail level. So post constitutional amendment, both center and states can tax both the goods and services up to the retail level, and this is a major reform. And this reform is not adequately highlighted. What does that mean? That means both center and states have given up their exclusive taxation rights to have a simple tax. I think that shows the federal system has matured in India. And there is a sense of trust among the union and the state government to give up their exclusive taxation rights to have a better and simple tax. I think this was not possible probably 30 years back, but this is happening because everybody understands the benefits of common market and benefits of good economic policy. I think that's what has driven this process. So that fundamental constitutional reform is constitutional amendment and subsequent paving the way for GST is something which is critical to understand why GST is so important to have a good good tax with a unified common market, with an idea of an unified and common market. Now, on the post GST introduction, there are too many issues. First issue is the number of rates. Now we are facing a situation where we have too many rates. One, we have 3% rate on gold and other precious metal, then we have a 5% rate, then 12% rate, and then we have a 8% rate. On that, there is a cess. So these rates are more than the number of rates probably we had before VAT. Because if we just take VAT of goods, there are two rates, 14.5 and 6%. And now these rates are to be also apportioned between center and states, and that created problems for the small trades, even for the big business. So I think on the question of a tax which is not delivering, I think the fundamental issue lies in the complex nature in which it has been implemented, having too many rates. Now, a lot of people say this is an over-determined model at the moment, so it needs to be simplified. I'll come to that little later, but first let me talk about certain issues that makes the tax system itself complex, and that starts from the very beginning, that is from the constitutional amendment. And that has got to do with the political economy of tax reform in a federal system. It is nobody can be blamed for that. These are the compromises that one has to make. First is the incomplete coverage of the tax base. Now, what is the incomplete coverage of the tax base? There are so many goods and so many services kept out of GST for revenue consideration. For example, petroleum and alcohols are out of GST because 40% of state revenues come from petroleum and alcohol products. Sorry, 40% of state's tax revenue comes from petroleum and alcohols. So this is kept out of GST. Now this is there in the constitutional amendment, and the constitutional amendment says at a later date GST Council will decide about the inclusion of petroleum products into the GST. So I had appeared before the Select Committee of Rajya Sabha when the bill was sent to the Select Committee, and I had submitted before them that if that is the case, then why don't you put a date? You say that I'll do it into 2030, but that was not done, or 2050, but that was not done. So if petroleum product does not come under GST, you continue to have the problem of cascading of taxes, because diesel is an intermediate input and you will never get tax credit for that. So the benefit of GST that we are talking about would always be suboptimal, because constitutional amendment has created a situation where we have an incomplete coverage of base. We don't have a complete coverage of base. So what we need now, probably the GST Council, I think, understand this very well. I think over next 1 or 2 years, they should try to bring in petroleum products into the GST net. And if that is brought in, I think it will also it will help in a great way by it will help both industry and service, both goods and services, in terms of removing cascading and helping GDP growth. Is that possible? We have to see. Now, so universal application of GST is very important, and this is also linked to the common market. Now, for example, we are talking about one market, one rate. That's a very good idea. That should happen. We should not have fragmented market system. Can GST automatically provide that? I think no. There are many taxes, interstate taxes still exist. There are many local body taxes still exist. So if you go to Noida and come back to Delhi, you stand in a queue. If you are going in a yellow taxi, then you pay the toll tax and then come into GST, enter Delhi. So, and that's the case with other states as well. So I think when we are talking about unified common market, this incomplete coverage of taxes would continue to play as barriers to common markets. But the improvement that we had post GST is definitely significant. Now what should be done? The kind of challenges that we have, what should be done? One, the first issue, I think we need to reduce the number of rates. I think these are expectations, and those expectations are right. And if we look at generally worldwide, there are 140 countries plus have GST now, and you don't see 6 different rates of GST. I think we should slowly move, not slowly, very quickly actually. We should very quickly move to a 2-rate structure, and I'm very happy to note that 172 commodities have been brought down from 28% rate last evening to 18% rate. So essentially, I think we should get rid of the 28% rate over time in the short run. And if at all we have to keep 28% rate, and given the fact that you want to bring in petroleum products into the GST network. That's the GST Council's decision at a later date. I think that 28% rate can be put as a floor rate for the petroleum products. So so what I'm trying to say is, as a design, you can still bring petroleum products into GST and yet tax at a higher rate. So it does not, so it cleans up the system. It allows you to take the benefits of input tax credit from petroleum products, but you continue to protect your revenue. I think that is possible, and that's what should be done. Now, second design issue that I thought I would not say, but let me say this. I think there is another problem, not a problem. I think central government was too generous when it came to the issue of compensation. So states' revenues, we work on state finances in an IPAP. So I was looking at, before coming here, I was looking at the data. So if you look at states' taxes, which are part of GST, and their growth rate in the last 5 years, they have been growing at the rate of around 10 to 11%. But center has agreed to give compensation to the states at 14% per annum for the next 5 years, and that would be 100%. So in a sense, all the states will be eligible for compensation if there is no huge, if the revenue buoyancy is so huge that it would get a tax which is more growing at more than 14% rate. So I think this compensation also something which creates a disincentive for tax collections. I'm not taking all the state. I'm not saying all the states would do, but I think it's a huge compensation that states are going to get. And this compensation will be given based on a cess on 28% rate, and if the cess amount is not sufficient, there will be more cess. So it actually, this heavy load of compensation actually also creating a complicated tax system where GST is also now having a cess at the highest rate of tax of 28%. I think there some rethinking is important to clear up the GST and having a more simplified GST structure. Now, when I argue about GST compensation shouldn't have been 14%, it should have been lower when states' revenues are growing at a lower rate. So somebody's deficit will go up. So if we look at the macroeconomic sense, if center is giving compensation, so center's deficit will go up. So if we talk about macro stability, it's not going to help anyone. So in that case, we should work towards having a higher revenue mobilization rather than depending on compensation for the next 5 years. 5 years is a very long time. So it should be reduced. Now, on the question of, this is my last point, on the question of vertical fiscal imbalance, if we look at the total taxes that have come under GST, and you bifurcate it between union and the states, and 60% of the total indirect taxes in the country is collected by states, and that have come under GST, and those taxes have come under GST. And center collects roughly 40% of the total indirect taxes. Now, so the base is same, but the council has decided, states are also party to this decision, that there would be symmetric division of rates. So if it is 12, 6 for the center, 6 for the states. If it is 18, 9 for the center, 9 for the states. If it is 28, 14 for the center, 14 for the states. I think that was not desirable. GST task force, Chief Economic Advisors Committee on Revenue Neutral Rate, and our NIPAP report have always said that state rate should be higher than the central rate. Now, on a tax base where states were collecting 60% of the revenue, it has become now 50-50. So I think what is most important now, to reduce compensation, at the same time have an asymmetric apportionment of rate, where states have a higher rate, central has a lower rate. So otherwise what would happen post GST, as you see yesterday, some of the states have said that only 5 states had so far mobilized revenue where they did not have a revenue loss. All rest of the states had a revenue loss. So I think it is important that that this rate structure is made asymmetric, where states are allowed to tax at a higher rate, center at a lower rate, so that existing level of vertical fiscal imbalance is maintained. I am not saying that it is improved, just maintained. If that is not done, this 50-50 sharing of tax rate would have an huge impact on the vertical fiscal imbalance between union and the states, and in that case, compensation is not the option. Why should a subnational government depends on compensation when there is a constitutional right to taxes? It's a question of dividing the rate between the center and states depending on what their bases were, and that has not been done. If that is done, that would help the states to mobilize more revenue, and center doesn't have to give them compensation and in turn create a macroeconomic fiscal imbalance for itself. So, but in conclusion, it's a fundamental reform, and if we are able to make taxes simple, bring universal coverage of GST like petroleum bringing in, and have two-rate structure, eventually getting rid of the 28% rate and the cess, I think GST is going to benefit the economy in a very significant way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pinaki, for covering all the points relevant for GST. There is simply no doubt. I think all of us would agree that it's an excellent idea to have a goods and services tax uniform across the country. The only issue that you have raised is the division part, and all that is very important. The second issue, which is equally important when we think about design, is that among these states, there is, in terms of levels of development and levels of requirements of tax are very different. And how is it that you can respond GST to that part also? You know, that if you have, say, a high tax rate on manufacturing and lower tax rate on what you might give farming goods and so on, then those states which are manufacturing, they will be affected much more than those states which are doing farming. And we all want employment to move from farming to manufacturing. So what will be the effect? I mean, these are some of the issues that you might want to explore further. You know, but all the suggestions that you have made are very worthwhile, and I thank you very much for doing it. Now, later, I mean, I think the discussion part would be later. I'm just responding to what he has said in an excellent presentation. And now we have 15 more minutes before we break for tea. It is on some select issues in the financial markets. And I see, where is Tushar? Oh, right there. Okay. So Tushar Gupta of the HDFC Bank is here. Huh? Arora. Sorry. Tushar Arora is here, but Shakshi Gupta is not here.
Yeah,
but
so
Tushar. Huh?
I'll be presenting.
So Tushar, yeah, on behalf of the HDFC Bank, you can present. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So I'll be talking about three key issues, and I think all of these issues are currently being discussed everywhere in the media and by all the policymakers. One, of course, is the recapitalization move, which is being recently announced by the government. What is our take on this? There is not much detail available on this issue, but maybe I will try and raise some questions and what are the key concerns that this move is trying to cater to. Secondly, I'll be talking about the credit growth and how the credit growth has come down. Mr. Jalan raised about the issue of cyclical and structural factors about growth. I think one side of the coin is talking about the credit growth and talking about the factors from the cyclical and structural side of the credit growth and why it has been coming down in India. And third, of course, it's the 1 year anniversary of the demonetization move. So how can I miss on that? I'll be talking about that as well. So starting with the recap move of the government, just to give you a brief snapshot of this policy move, government has announced around 2.1 trillion of bank recapitalization plan for the PSUs. Now, major chunk of it is expected to come in the form of bonds, around 1.3 trillion or so. 20,000 crores is, I think, part of their already announced Indradhanush scheme, according to which they were, expected to infuse around 10,000 crores per annum program for the PSU banks. And remaining 58,000 crores or so is expected that that the PSU banks will raise themselves by selling stakes in the equity market or so. What is really the concern of the market is that how will this 1.35 trillion will be financed? Government, as of now, the plan is that the government will be issuing bonds, which I think they have tried and tested sometime in early 90s. They'll be issuing these bonds, and banks which have excess, money, they'll be subscribing to these bonds, and then government will have a pool of money around 1.35 trillion or so, and they'll be distributing that money in the form of fresh infusion of capital to banks which lack the required capital requirements as per the Basel requirements, which are they expected to hold on to. This is a brief chart which shows the process how it will work like, and these are some of the banks which are really in a troubling situation. I think on the left hand side are the banks which have their CET ratio less than 8%. So as per the Basel III requirements, their capital reserve ratio should be around 8%. And some of the banks are holding on to that benchmark, but some of the banks are really in trouble. So maybe how it will work like is that there will be interbank transfers. So banks with surplus money will be transferring money to the banks with have deficit money, or banks with surplus money will transfer money to the government, and then they will transfer the money to the banks which have deficit money. So in all, the main crux of the matter is that it will be liquidity neutral, and that's the main point which is most important for the markets. There will be no liquidity impact as of now, what the government is saying. And that's why there should not be any major impact on the bond yields, on the wholesale interest rates of the market. And this is the main point which in markets we are looking at. If there is no impact on interest rates in the wholesale market, then it's fine. Just to give you a brief pros and cons of the move, obviously, I mean, we all are aware of the capital requirements of the banks, and how this move will cater to those demands. Some estimates are that the capital requirements of the bank is in the tune of 1.6 to 1.8 lakh crores. So given that they have announced a move of around 2.1 lakh crores, it means they are also factoring in some sort of growth from these banks, and it takes care of another 2 years or so of capital requirements from the banking sector. So it's a far-sighted move in that regard. I think all of us remember the gains in the stock market after this move, which happened the next day. A lot of PSU banks gained, and these are the valuation gains which they are likely to be beneficial with. So the 58,000 crore, the next tranche of it, which banks are expected to garner themselves. I think if there are valuation gains in this regard, then that would be helpful for banks. They would be able to sell their equity shares at a much higher price, and they would be able to garner resources at a very after dissolving at a lower stake from their balance sheet. What are some unanswered questions? Some unanswered questions are whether these bonds will be part of the SLR or not, because end of the day it would eat the appetite of the banking sector. Their liquidity, I think, if they are not buying other bonds, they will have to go for these bonds. So they will have to be given this leeway that these bonds qualify for SLR. So this is an unanswered question. Secondly, there would be, of course, some impact on the fiscal deficit. So around 8 to 9,000 crores of interest payments every year. It is not much given the likely support they are giving, but obviously it will add to the burden when tax payments are not much, when the disinvestments are not following in a very robust manner. And obviously, I mean, it has to be followed up with some major reforms. Just to give you an example and leave the floor, open in this regard. The SBI, for example, their overall NPA ratio is around 15-16%. Out of that, only 1 to 2% is in the retail book category. That is the personal loans they give, which is not much. Rest 14-15% is in their corporate book category. So they are doing okay in terms of their personal loans. They are able to judge the credit worthiness of the borrowers in the retail segment. But when it comes to the corporate sector, they are not. There's something going on wrong there. So the same manager is able to do the task very well when it comes to the retail segment, but something is happening with the corporate sector. So I think this is the main concern. This is the thing which has to be brought to the forefront, and this is a good move, but it has to be followed up with the reforms and overall managerial issues, and which I think government is very much aware of it. But I think I was hearing to Mr. Jaitley after the press conference that these moves would be announced after a few months. So I think these are the things which would be really watching out for. If you go to the next thing, that is the credit growth, I think the common understanding is that the demonetization led to a complete collapse in the credit growth, which is actually not true. If we look at a long-term chart, credit growth in India has been coming down since 2011 or so. So it is not just a recent phenomena. Credit growth has been going down from say 11-12% to around 5-6%. It collapsed to 5-6% just after the demonetization. Obviously, a lot of factors are at play, and we have segregated them into demand side factors. We have segregated them into supply side factors. There's a bit of not bit actually. There's a lot of disintermediation also happening. So a lot of borrowers are moving from banking sector credit to corporate bonds to the bond market. So there has to be a normal slowdown in credit growth as banks as borrowers move from banking sector to other mediums of capital. So this is something which is normal. But if we're having a slowdown which is more than that, then that needs to be dealt with, and that we have to have a clear understanding of that. And this is what this chart really shows on the left hand side. So we have looked at variables like non-agri GDP growth. We have looked at capacity utilization. We have looked at lending rate as the price of credit. As we have looked at corporate bond issuances to understand the disintermediation which is happening. We have also looked at commodity prices growth, which is really I think. Commonly, I think this is ignored, but this is a very important variable which determines the working capital requirements of the Indian corporate sector, and I think this is a very important variable for credit growth understanding. And the chart below really sums it all. I think 2 years back when Uday bond issuances were done, it took away large portion of credit outflow from the banking sector, and this is what explains around 200 basis point decline in the credit growth for the banking sector. This is the part which we should not be really worried about, because it just happened that the balance sheet switch happened from credit to investments for bank. That is, they were given bonds in lieu of the credit they had given to the power companies. The demand side factors is a bit of a concern, and this really comprises of the slowdown in the GDP growth, the slowdown in the manufacturing sector, the private capex slowdown which everybody knows about, and lastly the supply side factors. The disintermediation is also part of it. By supply side factors, we mean that the NPA issue. So here our commodity is really the money. So for the suppliers, that is the banks. The NPA issue, they are not able to handle the understanding of the credit worthiness of the borrowers. They are not able to understand really what is really the proper project financing in this state of affairs should be. And disintermediation, that is shifting away from banking sector to the bond market, is also part of it. So overall this determines around 250 basis point decline in the credit growth. So this gives a brief summary as to where should we be focusing on, whether interest rate cut would really help or not. Whether banking sector recapitalization would really help or not, because ultimately demand side factors are also playing a role, and there also you need to bring in some stimulus. Lastly, on the demonetization and digitization, I would be talking about three key things. We talk about decline in the cash to GDP ratio. So has cash usage declined permanently, whether there is a secular decline to it or not? This is one question. And other side of the other side of the coin is whether the digital platforms have picked up substantially or not. We saw a large increase in the use of Paytms. Whether this is still going on or not, this is the issue which I'll be discussing. And lastly, are we really measuring the success in the right way? Are we looking at all the factors which demonetization really impacted? So on the cash issue, the common thing which is really cited is that the cash in the system today is less than what the pre-demonetization level was. So if you look at the chart on the left-hand side, we have around 12% lower cash than what existed in the system before the demonetization. But is it really the right way of looking at it? I think early 2016, the debate was that the cash in the system, the currency in circulation has really moved up very fast. I think everybody that time was concerned about that issue. I remember Dr. Raghuram Rajan pointing this out and relating this to the elections in the states of India that time. There were 4 or 5 key elections in the state assemblies which happened that time, and there were a number of theories floated then that they were trying to explain the increase in currency in circulation. But I'm not trying to go into the reason of that. What I'm trying to say is that the level of currency in circulation in 2016, just before the pre-demonetization level, was a bit of an aberration. It was not the normal level which was prevailing in the system. So we need to adjust for that. We need to statistically, adjust and see. If you look at the chart on the right-hand side, this one, if you look at the trend, cash has really moved back to the trend. So this is one question I think which we all should be looking at. If you look at the cash withdrawals from the ATMs after going down in January, Feb levels, it is again going back. It is in fact more than what was happening earlier. So the average level of cash withdrawal is around 3,000 rupees per transaction, and we have already touched that level again. So this question of cash going down is, I think, which we should be trying to understand in a much more detailed level. The second thing about the digitization, I would just like to point out this chart which really summarizes the issue. So what we look at is that I would just take one more minute. If we look at the trend before demonetization, digitization was anyway going up, the digital transactions. And if we try and extrapolate the number, this red line is the trend which we would have landed at in the month of August and September. And if you see, this blue line is the actual line of all the digital modes of payment, and it is slowly converging with the red line which we had. So did demonetization really change things for us? This is again an issue which we should be looking at. Lastly, what is then the right measure of measuring success? I think the change in consumer behavior is a very long-term thing. It won't happen at a stroke, and I think it would take some years or so. What has really happened is this thing on the left-hand side. The infrastructure of digital transaction, the digital modes of payment has really improved. I'll just give you one statistic. We had around 1.5 million or so the POS terminals all over the country, and this has really doubled within a span of 7-8 months. And this is the kind of push which demonetization has really given us. So it is the increase in infrastructure, the improvement in infrastructure which has happened at a very swift pace, and we should take proud of that fact instead of really talking about the change in consumer behavior, because that's a long-term thing. It might ultimately happen, but we need firstly the infrastructure to make it happen, and that has really happened, I think. And we should also be looking at the B2B transactions, which really is the I think right way of measuring success in this regard, but we are really focusing on B2C transactions for measuring it. The problem is we don't even have enough data for this. So this is another question or a query, I think, which government should be looking at. They should be trying to measure the B2B transactions in a very efficient way and trying to put out the data in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tushar, for raising all the very relevant issues. And one point that we should discuss when after tea break would be, in fact, the governance issues in public sector banks.
Yeah.
In the sense that it's not public sector per se. I mean, you need public sector banks in terms of for priority sector lending, rural areas, access to finance, and so on and so forth. All that is very well. But in terms of governance, what is it that can be done? I mean, we have UPSC, we have CAG, we have Election Commission, all government institutions, entirely public sector, and gives you the, freest elections. CAG audits the government financial system. UPSC recruits people for our government. So why can't we have a public sector banking system which replicates what you might say autonomy to a certain extent? I mean, this is one issue that we might discuss a little more, in addition to all the excellent points that you have made, Tushar. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now, Mr. Shah, will you invite us for tea?
I will invite you for tea, certainly. I think it's well-deserved and well-earned. We've had a very rich discussion. So we've actually got a nice, long 30-minute break. We're exactly on time, thanks to Dr. Jalan's expert stewardship of not just the economy over the years, but of this session. So let's come back exactly at 11:30. There will be a school bell that will remind you that you need to come back into this room. So we have 25 minutes or so.
Thank you.